Okay, why don't we get started? Thank you all for coming. My name is Joe Levine. I'm a professor in the philosophy department, and I want to make just a few comments about the setting, the Matthews lecture itself, and then introduce our speaker, and then it'll launch into his talk. So, in 2015, we established the Gary Matthews Endowment in Philosophy to honor our late colleague Gareth Matthews. Widely known for his academic work in ancient philosophy, ethics, and the philosophy of religion, Gary was also committed to taking philosophy outside the academy. He was a pioneer in teaching philosophy to young children, and this is work that we have people currently in the department carrying on. The center actually is up. We actually now have a Matthews Center, right, for philosophy for children, and working with schools around the world. And he put his ethical values into practice as an activist in movements for peace and social justice, which has a lot to do with the themes that we have had in every single one of our Matthews lectures. The endowment enables us to bring to campus biennially an eminent philosopher whose research honors the memory of Gary's academic achievements and social engagement. Today marks the fourth lecture in the series. The first Matthews lecture in 2016 was Charles Mills, who unfortunately passed away a few years later. The second was Miranda Fricker, and the third was Jason Stanley, and that gives you an idea about the kind of people that we have been inviting. Okay, so today, our fourth lecture in the series continues our tradition of bringing philosophers who combine rigorous analysis with social political engagement. Professor Olúfémi Táíwò is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Georgetown University. He received his PhD in philosophy at the University of California, Los Angeles. He has published in academic journals ranging from Public Affairs Quarterly, One Earth, Philosophical Papers, and the American Philosophical Association newsletter, Philosophy and the Black Experience. Táíwò's theoretical work draws liberally from the Black radical tradition, anti-colonial thought, German transcendental philosophy, contemporary philosophy of language, contemporary social science, and histories of activism and activist thinkers. His public philosophy, including articles exploring intersections of climate justice and colonialism, have been featured in The New Yorker, The Nation, Boston Review, Dissent, well, all of them. And he's the author of Elite Capture and Reconsidering Reparations, and also another book that I just got, which is the one on decolonization, but I haven't read it yet. Okay, so I also want to make a few personal remarks about my discovery of his work and engagement with it. I guess it was in February of 22, Professor Táíwò published an essay in an online journal called The Philosopher. I don't know if people have seen that, called Being in the Room, Privilege, Elite Capture, and Epistemic Deference. And I read that, and immediately I thought, I need to read more of this guy. It captured my imagination, the way that he entered what can be a very sensitive and difficult debate within the progressive community. And so the two books of his I have read are the ones mentioned, Elite Capture and Reconsidering Reparations, and in fact, Reconsidering Reparations, we just talked about it in my class yesterday. And what strikes me about the work I've read are, well, first of all, the encyclopedic knowledge of all of the historical and social scientific terrain around which he does his philosophical work. I feel like he must be about half my age, but I figure if I've read half the books he's read, I'm doing well. But then, aside from that encyclopedic knowledge, and keen, rigorous analysis, which you find in many philosophers, is also something that you don't always find in other philosophers, and that is a very synthetic ability, an ability to take what are controversies that involve people in conflict on both sides, like about reparations. And then, at the same time, somehow find the truth, the nuggets of truth in both sides, and find a way of fashioning a position that includes those nuggets of truth without necessarily, confronting in a somewhat philosophically aggressive and critical way, though not that he shies from criticism. So that's what I think we'll hear today. And I also just want to mention, and I'll probably mention this again, that there's also a talk to the philosophy department, more specialized talk for the philosophy department that's happening, but everyone who's here is invited if you'd like to make it, at 9 a.m. tomorrow morning. It's called Action as Co-Production. It's in this building. It's that way, right? Room South College E470. Okay, without further ado, please help me welcome Professor Olúfémi Táíwò.
Thanks so much, Professor Lamine, for that really generous introduction. Thanks to the department here, to Beth, to everybody who helped put this talk together. I'm really glad to get to talk to you all at all, and I'm really honored in particular to get to give Matthew's lecture and to be part of the legacy in honor of a colleague of ours who worked on issues that are particularly of importance to me, and I think a lot of our colleagues now, philosophy around education, particularly of young folks. And it is also near and dear to the heart of one Olúfémi, who is going to be at the center of what I would like to talk about today. The quote that comes as the title of today's talk, The Point is to Change It, is of course not a quote from Olúfémi, but it's a quote from another guy, one Karl Marx. And it's a quote that I've come back to a lot. I ended the Elite Capture book with setting this quote next to another one that I will show you on a slide here in a second. But when it came to both of these quotes that stick in my head, I really want to ask the question that's on the screen now. What is the point of learning? Why do we bother doing whatever it is that we do here at universities, at institutions of higher learning? And there's a way that we can ask this question that asks it in a sort of trans-historical, across all eras, sort of bent. Maybe this is the kind of frame that Karl Marx had in mind when he was reading the works of his contemporary Ludwig Feuerbach and scribbling angry notes about what pissed him off about Ludwig's arguments, which is of course where this quote, "The point is to change it," comes from. Right? So Karl Marx was making a point about philosophy, what's important about it, why we bother doing it. We could describe the world in intimate detail. We could get those descriptions better or worse, or more or less parsimonious. We could imagine some other sort of value or perhaps truth for philosophy and our philosophical insights. But in general, he seems to think the point of doing this kind of inquiry, the point of doing theory, the point of doing philosophy is to make the world different. I don't necessarily disagree. In fact, I don't disagree. I agree with that. But I do think that question takes on a different hue, I guess, in a time like ours. And it's thinking about our time, our era, our epoch that drove me to this second quote that's up here. That is, I think, just as profound. So this second quote comes from Ndaye, who is an Afro-Guyanese activist and thinker who was writing about the contemporary Caribbean struggle, as the name of her address shows us. And she said, old foundations are crumbling and new ones are not yet being imagined. There was a literal sense in which she meant this. She was writing after a major hurricane that destroyed much of Guyana's infrastructure and did damage that amounted to nearly 2/3 of the country's GDP in a single hurricane. But she was talking more generally as well about how we're going to go on the business of living. She was talking about the weather. Climate change is among the various civilizational risks, I suppose you could call them, the planetary scale crises that are confronting us, those of us who live in the year 2023. And it gives us reasons for thinking about the value of education that perhaps Karl Marx didn't have. Right? That not every generation of human beings is going to confront. And I don't just mean this in terms of values. I mean, in a literal sense, there is human activity happening right now that is reshaping the world. There are the ways that we're doing it indirectly, the emissions from our consumption that are changing the Earth's temperature. There are ways that we're doing it directly in a straightforwardly ecological sense, extracting ancient wells of groundwater from underneath the Earth's surface. But there are ways that we're doing it politically as well. In the years that have passed since Ndaye wrote this quote, and even in the short time since I referenced them in a book, there's a foundation being built for a new Guyanese economy, and it is being built by ExxonMobil. Just months ago, it combined with partners in a consortium to put up some 13 billion or so for the construction of a floating platform and offshore oil production rig. It would be the 6th offshore oil production project by ExxonMobil as Guyana speeds along its emergence as the world's fastest growing new oil province. People are hard at work, changing so many things, causing so many crises that we can't keep up with them. Some historians have long been using the term polycrisis, but it's gaining currency as people put together weird maps like the circles and nodes that you see on the screen now, trying to keep track of all the various risks to all the various aspects of human society that are cropping up. Just to belabor a few of them, the scale at which we are depleting the groundwater underneath our feet is so many billions of gallons that we've actually changed the tilt of the Earth along its axis. We all remember pandemics, I assume COVID and such. And as the permafrost melts, we will meet new and one would hope friendlier pathogens. That's where we're going. So it's in this context and not a general thought about why it's cool to read books that I think we should ask the question, what's the point of learning? Frege asked this question as well. And in some recent work, I've been trying to think about it. And I've been thinking about it in a particular domain with regard to a specific subject, and that is what's known as identity politics. So broadly, the idea that politically we should take into account where people are located, how people's experiences add up to different kinds of being in the complex social system that we all live in together. And not only should we keep track of that for descriptive purposes, for knowing how social systems differentially affect Black people versus white people, Muslim people versus Christian people, et cetera, but we should affirmatively, when we're in the business of operating politically, when we're in the business of organizing to reach one political outcome or other, we should also take into account those sorts of identity markers, those sorts of distinctions in between people. So that is roughly what people understand as identity politics. I'm on board, I'm on the team. Not everybody is. Identity politics has come under criticism, particularly in recent years, and I think some of those criticisms are apt. And so I wrote a thing to try to sort out which are which. So which are the good criticisms, which are the bad ones. How should we think of identity politics given ways that identity politics have gone in recent years? So broadly, on the thumbs down side of things, there's a way of mobilizing identity politics, there's a way of thinking about identity politics that I'm not quite so enthusiastic about. And that's a way that's leveraged identity politics to manage disputes over attention or credibility, perhaps political leadership, perhaps most centrally political leadership. Who should take their cues from whom? Alongside that has come something of a skepticism around working across identities in some corners by some people. I'm just going to group these tendencies together. I've broadly been referring to them as deference politics. I'm against this particular way of thinking about identity politics, and I've had a lot to say about why. To just give a little bit of the flavor of why, I'm not going to go through all of these today, because I want to focus on education in particular. But I think there's a better use that we can put the knowledge that's being created by identity politics, and I mean this in the broadest sense, by this outlook, by academics, by activists, by social commentators, that is taking seriously what kinds of people are and how different kinds of people are differentially affected by the injustices of the world around us. I think that's a valuable focus. We've learned a lot from it. And I want to be clear about what uses of it I'm for and what uses of it I'm less excited about, let's say. So here's an example of what I'm just terming deference politics. I don't know, maybe the younger of you in the room might not remember this, but I feel like this was every other article back in the late 2010s, mid 2010s, at least on my side of the internet. I read a bunch of these. This is just one example thereof. And these articles used insights, in this case, a newly popular term called gaslighting to describe a form of psychological and interpersonal abuse where the gaslighter makes the gaslightee question their sense of reality. And this kind of knowledge, this kind of experiential knowledge that people have gotten from theoretical reflection, but also the experience of having this form of abuse leveraged against them, is a thing that people rightly started paying attention to. This is an interpersonal dynamic we should be able to spot, we should hopefully be able to prevent, and that we should talk about. And one form of talking about this sort of thing is in the example you see above. So this is from an article that is contesting different ways of relating between Black and non-Black members of, in this case, I believe, a nonprofit organization. So this is one use of this new knowledge that's being created that one could get up to. Here's a second. So around the same time, in these same years, the 2010s, there was a new trend in organizing being developed by a number of unions, perhaps most prominently the Chicago Teachers Union. And they were reinvigorating labor organizing using an extensively collaborative approach to organizing that they and others have called bargaining for the common good. So maybe the typical way of thinking about what unions do is they get together workers in a particular shop or organization, and those workers decide what's good for them and what do they want to fight for and what they want to bargain for, and they do so collectively. The approach that the CTU took certainly involved fighting for what the workers wanted, but involved bridging gaps between the workers and their broader community, between the workers, the teachers in this case, and their students, and bringing together a broader collective between unions and non-union entities, and pushing for things that would benefit all of the above. So not just wages and benefits for people in the union, but also increases in living standards for the people their unions were connected to. So the demands that they fought for, many of which they won in this particular influential strike, included some of the stuff that characterizes the sort of social justice values that I think members of these unions would share in common with the author in the first example. They won particular protections for people of color, in particular immigrant families. They won nurses and social workers to be added to schools. They won wage increases. And so a mix of wage increases, things that are par for the course of workers organizing, and some other stuff. The contrast I'm trying to make is this. There's a way of thinking about what we learn when we study social justice and related topics, when we come up with new ways of understanding oppression, new fancy terms like gaslighting, that directs the output of that knowledge to interpersonal interactions, to the person who wields that knowledge moving throughout the world in a different way. That's the approach that I am connecting with this term deference politics. But there's another way to use that knowledge, which is perhaps more invested in building the power to alter the structures that cause abuse and injustice in the first place. Building the sorts of people that help decide what the broader world is like. As I'm going to go on to discuss, as we discuss Frady and some of this more straightforwardly theoretical stuff, I think this is ultimately the kind of thing he's thinking about. You don't have to support CTU as a particular union. You don't have to even be pro-labor politics to understand, hopefully, the point that Frady will be driving at in just a second, which is the Chicago teachers took it upon themselves to decide what Chicago should be like. Right? Not to decide how they were going to talk about Chicago, not to decide how they were going to survive Chicago. They wanted to be at the negotiating table, and literally were, when figuring out what their lives in general were going to be about. So I'm going to come back to this once we have a little bit more of the Frady on the table. But for now, I'll leave this section just keeping that one thing in mind. Chicago versus interpersonal interactions within the media. So I've been trying to beat up on deference politics indirectly by saying there's some better thing that we could be doing, and it's emblematic of what the Chicago Teachers Union was doing in the 2010s. But how could I make this case more directly? How could I say more directly what's wrong with this way of thinking about politics, and, as I'm going to suggest in a second, this way of thinking about what learning is for? What's the point of coming up with new terms like gaslighting? What's the point of communicating to them, to people who are learning either in school or via think pieces? Why do we do all this? The point of learning is to change things. Of course, as we saw, Marx thought that, and Táíwò thought that. This guy also thought that. Paulo Freire is an important Brazilian philosopher, intellectual, and educator. He did teaching as part of his public service in Brazil. He wrote a number of books, some of which I'll talk about, defending some key ideas that he had about how education should go. And he saw this as deeply tied to how politics should go in general. So in addition to serving in several roles as an education minister, he was also very politically involved, so much so that he had to flee Brazil during its military dictatorship. He was notably an advisor to the African Party for the independence of Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, which was a revolutionary party fighting a war of independence with the Portuguese Empire throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And he played roles in Brazilian politics that were very important during his exile and afterwards. Why is education so tightly bound with political life in general? Isn't politics what happens when you go to the polls every couple of years and pick a name off a list? And education is some other thing that happens when you go to school, K-12 in the United States, and maybe a few other extra years if you've got the money and the SAT scores. I think Frady thinks about politics in a different sense than that. And I think Freire would even think that if anyone out there thinks about politics in that way, it might be because of these two concepts on the board. So how is it that some people think about education? The more famous of these is probably the idea of banking. Paulo Freire has this description of some approaches to teaching that he describes as banking. So the truth, knowledge is a fully formed thing that exists in the head of the teacher or perhaps in the curriculum. And the process of education on this model is thought of as copy-pasting that thought in the teacher's head into the head of the student. So it doesn't treat the student-teacher relationship with its rightful importance. It doesn't think of even the content of what is taught as something that's supposed to emerge from that interaction, but rather it precedes the interaction. There's a lot of complaints that Freire has about this. But the central one, I think, is, at least for our purposes today, is that the student is passive in this model of education. The student is just the recipient of education, conceived of as the sort of transfer of knowledge from person who has it to person who does not. This is tied fairly directly, I think, to a lesser known concept of Freire's, which I guess you could translate as massification. He really likes to come up with words. There's no direct, nice-seeming translation for this. But what he's describing is the conversion of masses of people into an object. And so population of people could be a number of individuals in a complex map of social relationships that we should be trying to navigate together. Or it could be items on a spreadsheet that we're trying to manipulate in the way perhaps that a marketer tries to drum up revenue for a company, or maybe even perhaps the way that a political advertiser tries to mobilize votes for their candidate. Right? So when we regard people as things, objects, whose behavior we try to influence and manipulate with various causal levers, we're doing the population level equivalent of the thing the teacher does when the teacher relates to a student in front of them as a passive recipient of information. So when Freire is talking about massification, he's not simply talking about public education, he's talking about public management in general. But the way that he talks about education, as on the banking model, makes the same basic criticism. These are ways of failing to treat people as subjects. To see something like it, we could think about that COVID thing I mentioned earlier. A couple colleagues of ours, Sylvia Ivani and Katarina Duccio-Novaes, wrote in Boston Review recently about the governmental response to COVID and the decades-long growth of a way of thinking about public information and science education that they contend is part and parcel of this response. They think about questions that policymakers have asked in the past. Would the world be better, or even a different place if the public understood more of the scope and the limitations, the findings, and the methods of science? Why are people doing all this anti-science stuff? Why are they refusing vaccinations? Why do they ignore mask mandates? Well, maybe they don't understand science, and if they understood science more, they would follow the science. They would do the things that science tells you to do. Lucille Novaes and Ivani call this the knowledge deficit model of science communication. Freire might have called it the banking model of science communication, the goal of which is to produce the right collection of behaviors, mask compliance, vaccine compliance, which in turn fits an overall strategy of massification. Right? We're not looking into why it is that people won't comply with the dictates of science beyond, this simplifying assumption of it being driven by ignorance. And we're trying to figure out which pushes and pulls of scientific levers will get them to do the things that we want, without regard to the broader political situation in which people are manifesting anti-vax kind of sentiments. As it happens, there are empirical studies to suggest that the prescriptive side of this massification approach, this idea of inform people about the science, about the vaccine studies, and then they will do the thing that you want, that is a thing that has been studied and largely proven ineffective, particularly with vaccine compliance, though not exclusively with vaccine compliance. This is not actually the way to get people to comply or, quote unquote, follow the science. And Lucille Novaes and Ivani suggest that it's because the problem has been misposed. It may or may not be that people understand the finer points of how vaccines are reviewed, but that is not the only thing involved with people's decisions with whether or not to comply with mask mandates or whether or not to comply with vaccine mandates. There are deeper issues of social trust. They say social trust in science, which I think is certainly true, but I might put it social trust quite generally is not present in every person for every scientific authority, and this is something you would have to contend with directly if you wanted people to behave differently. Again, at bottom is the difference between two different approaches we could have for thinking about education or communication, whether it's of science, whether it's about vaccine mandates, or whether it's about communication around anything else. Are we educating people so that they will do what we want? Are we just trying to push and pull at the causal levers to herd masses of people into behaviors that policymakers want? Or do we have another view of education entirely? Education for man as a subject, as Freire puts it. So I'll tell you what Freire thinks and what he did. Freire thought, of course, as you could already have sensed, the right version of education happens with the people being educated. He is fixated on the oppressed because he is a good leftist. But what I think is maybe even more important than that is why this is different from the banking model. And why this version of education requires not just displacing our desire to control other people, but displacing the centrality of information and information transfer to the depiction of what education consists in. There is an information problem with many approaches to education. Here, Freire is drawing from the work of Gabriel Baudet, who is in the Chilean Institute for Agricultural Development. In their education programs, they found that the discussions they were having with campesinos were often meandering and didn't lead to the kinds of political changes that they were hoping. Even when the subjects of those discussions were things that were relevant to their life. Water management techniques, ways of thinking about the soil, things of practical importance to the campesinos. Those conversations didn't go anywhere, at least according to O'Day. But even the information that the campesinos needed to know was not just about the fact that water levels in their soil were decreasing, but they needed to know why. And those why questions, particularly in our day and age, would have straightforwardly ecological dimensions. Perhaps the world is getting hotter. But actually, it would also have political dimensions. Perhaps some people are making decisions about water management elsewhere in the water table that are relevant to your soil. But what it comes down to is not just having a mechanistic, excessively practical approach to the kind of education that's happening, but having one that is sensitive to the broader social and political environment that gives rise to the need for education in the first place. Why is your life going the way that it goes? And do you get to help decide how those things go? Do you get to affect how the water table is managed, not only on your land, but on surrounding land that connects to it? So that information gap, alongside the broader social relationships that should change between the teacher and the taught, the educator and the educated, are all key to this better view of education and its development that Freire comes to. This is another word that defies translation. People have tried critical consciousness, but I feel like that needs to be translated into English. So, yeah, so conscientisation, you can call it whatever you want, but there's this through line of all the things Freire has been saying, which is whatever conscientisation amounts to, whatever this better version of education amounts to, what it will produce are subjects. What you're starting with is a version of education, a version of thinking about information transfer, a banking approach to education, a massification approach to social control that treats people as objects to be managed. But you need to find a version of education that treats people as subjects. It would be easy to blame the political center for this. And of course, Freire, as any good leftist, does. Right? You know what bourgeois people want? You know what the capitalists want? They want people who do not think. Right? Who not only do not think, but can't. So they give people information that is partial. They tell you about the vaccine studies, but not big pharma or whatever, and they hope to herd you into the behavior that they want, regardless of what you actually think or whether you actually think. And the dominant elites go to any and every length to give people just enough information to herd them into the behavior that they want, but not give them the opportunity to develop their own analysis of their own political and ecological situation. But it's not just the people elsewhere on the political spectrum. Brady is very specific about this. The left, where he sees himself politically, also has this bad tendency in the pursuit of a quick revolution, in the pursuit of a triumphant gaining of power. Even people he would regard as comrades fall into this trap of treating people as objects And it thinks of this act as just a realistic concession to the status quo. But they too decide that other people are objects to push and pull at to provoke, in their case, revolution rather than the status quo. But in neither case are people being treated as subjects rather than objects. So, sum all this up, what Freire thinks about education is this. Revolutionary vanguard parties that don't meaningfully include the oppressed, the masses of the oppressed, as decision makers in their own political future. Thumbs down. Passive forms of education, where the educated in schools are being taken as repositories for information that is already known, for truths that are already known by educators. Also, thumbs down. Thumbs up. Sharing practically relevant information. That is a part of education. There is an informational component to education. But the point of that, the point of sharing practically relevant information isn't so that that information in a clandestine way affects people's behavior in a way that bypasses their own reasoning. But the point of giving people practically relevant information is so that they can participate in practical deliberation, so that they can decide together with the people around them what it is that they're going to do, and to make those decisions on the basis of their own commitments about why they want to do that. That will involve different kinds of relationships between teachers and educated, between the populations and masses of people that are managed by elites, by governments, by the World Bank, by the IMF, by large employers, by capitalists, into something more collaborative. In other words, the point is changing. This is not just the best view of politics, this is what education is for. This is why, as the title of his first book suggests, education is a practice of freedom and not just simply a social service. If education is done correctly, you create a kind of people that are subjects, that are participants in history, that are among those who are deciding the way things are going to go in the world, in their lives. That is not something you would do at the schoolhouse only. That's the kind of person you would be in general. So that's Freire's view. That's my view too. So if you dislike it, I hope to hear from you 20 minutes from now. But I will warm you up with some objections. There are, of course, many objections to all of the preceding, but I just want to start out with a couple just to get us warm for Q&A. I think one that's worth dealing with right off the bat is, Freire is obviously a very political guy. Is this a view of education that is political in the sense of turning education into activism? Kind of. But I think what people imagine by that is, well, if you think education is supposed to be tied to this broader view of what we're supposed to change in the world, then you're just empowering educators with this idea that they're supposed to be saving the world through their curricula, and you're giving them carte blanche to just try to manipulate all their students into doing their weird leftist bidding. So I think this is, what today's ideological opponents of critical race theory are imagining as they oppose its inclusion in K through 12 curricula and even higher education curricula across the country. I have many criticisms of that. But the first thing to say in light of this particular talk, and in light of what I've just covered about Fraley, is that what they're imagining is the banking model. What they're imagining is the thing Fraley is criticizing. Educators should be politically involved on Fraley's view, but that's not what education is. Education isn't the implantation of a ready-made political ideology or even set of practical objectives onto a unformed student who is a passive recipient of that doctrine. Education is the creation of a person who can decide for themselves what they would like to accomplish in the world and what they think is true and what they would like to be for. Right? So it is the furthest thing from what Fraley is imagining that this view of education should involve telling students what to do and very cleverly herding them into a predetermined ideology. And personally, if I had the power to secretly convert students into a predetermined ideology, it would be the predetermined ideology of doing the reading. And I've not gotten even that far, so, I think that's plenty. All right. Objection number 2. Okay, you might buy that there's something wrong with the banking model. There's something wrong with massification. There's something wrong with these ways of thinking about management of population and the way of thinking about managing the classroom in particular that are worth criticizing. But you could think that and still doubt Fraley's alternative. And one way of getting that going might just use the example that I brought up. So back to the COVID example and COVID vaccine compliance. Someone, I think very reasonably, could agree with me that the idea that getting vaccine compliance is just a matter of explaining to people how vaccines work. They could agree, okay, maybe that's not far enough, or maybe that's not a good enough response, without necessarily agreeing with Fraley's response. One way they could do that is to just say, well, no, there is something like the banking model going on. There is a pre-existing right answer about whether or not vaccines are safe. They are. There's a group of people that has that right answer, experts who ran the analyses of the safety and efficacy of the various vaccines, the experts, as it were. And there's a transfer that should happen. People should believe the results found by these experts, right? So if banking is too crude, if we can't just implant the truth about vaccines from the head of the experts into the population, we still need to do something like that. So why not think that the problem is just trust? And here I'm going in the direction suggested by Lucille Novaes and Ivani, whose work I mentioned earlier. There's experts who have the knowledge, and it's just that something other than information is breaking the transmission link between the people who have the knowledge and the people who don't have the knowledge. But if we could restore that transmission link by getting people to trust scientists rather than understand vaccine data, then we could get more or less the same kind of transfer that we're going for, from expert to non-expert. So I have a couple responses to this. I think they're just versions of the same response, but the first way of stating it, at least, is that is the kind of transformation, changing trust relationships, is the kind of transformation that Fraley is thinking about, or at least would be involved in the kind of transformation Fraley is thinking about. Trust relationships, I would argue, are constitutive of our political subjectivity. If I told you that a friend of mine went from listening to Rachel Maddow to listening to Joe Rogan and Tucker Carlson, I would be describing to you somebody who has likely changed a number of things about how they think about the world. They have changed their level of receptivity to some messages and decreased their level of receptivity to some messages, increased their receptivity to other messages. They likely have different friend groups, maybe even different hobby interests than they had before. There's a lot of changes to their political outlook and opinion and social relationships that are likely abbreviated by that first kind of depiction. Those things travel together because that's the way we live our lives. Who we listen to is affected by and in turn affects who we spend time with, what other people we listen to. Probably they're going to be people close in ideological similarity to Tucker Carlson and Joe Rogan, so on and so forth. They affect what kinds of information we get exposed to in the first place, so on and so forth. All those are social relationships. Who our friends are, what our news networks are, what our trust networks are, what things we ignore, what things we don't. And because of that, number two, if we wanted to do something like change people's level of trust in science, it's difficult to imagine how we could do that without changing how it is that science is run, how it is that scientific knowledge is produced, how it is that it is disseminated, changing things beyond how people intrasubjectively feel about science. The ways to change how people feel about things often involve changing those things or changing their relationship to those things. So, in effect, I'm saying tomato, tomato, right? You can say we want to change people's level of trust in science, but the plausible ways of doing that involve changing something about the broader social arrangements in and around which people develop and maintain that level of trust in science, which are going to involve broader social and political relationships. Okay, so I want to conclude, and I'm going to skip here back to this slide that we saw earlier. I started with this criticism of certain trends in, I guess we could call it social justice politics or identity politics, that I was less enthusiastic about. And other trends in politics that I'm very enthusiastic about. And I just want to tell a Freudian story about why. It's not that the people in the Chicago Teachers Union did not have the same kind